Thank you, Mark. I'm old school. I've got paper, so I'm going to ruin your computer and put this down. Is that a right? What? That's, that's it. And then I'm going to go to this. I think because I got that right sound. Oh, that perfect. We're coming. Yeah. So, Mark talked about having Miss America here yesterday. Sorry, Mister. By the way, Mark. Should have rescheduled this. And the importance of getting young people in this industry, and I see a lot of young people back out there. Just so you know, I'm not one of those. It was about a week ago that Mark asked me to reflect on the early days, the early history of the first incarnation of Energy Fuels and the White Mesa Mill. So I'm really quite honored to be able to give you a little insight into the early days to the history. Mark indicated I left Energy Fuels in 1992. I'd worked there for about 15 years, and then I retired from Cameco Corporation as the CEO after 18 years of working there. A little bit of simple math generates a lengthy career in the uranium industry, and one that overlaps the early pioneers of the industry, and happily for me, the current set of leaders, many of whom actually worked for me one or more times. And our host, Mark, actually, I don't know how many times, Mark, 3, 4, 5 times worked for me at both Energy Fuels and at Cameco. And hearing this, with the current success, the prospects for Energy Fuels, Mark, I couldn't be more proud of what you've done as the leader of this company. There's another colleague that should be remembered, the late Steve Anthony. That was Mark's predecessor as the CEO of Energy Fuels, and it was Steve and I that actually then tried to recruit Mark to come back and be the CEO. Turned out Steve was my roommate when I was at the Colorado School of Mines. He was a lifelong friend and a strong advocate for nuclear and energy fuels. So, the first uranium pioneer that I encountered, I was a young lawyer, and the individual I encountered was the legendary Bob Adams. Now, before I met Bob, he was a restaurateur, a milkman, and a uranium explorer focused on southern Wyoming. And using piloting skills that he'd learned in World War II, Bob flew his open cockpit plane low over the Wyoming desert with a scintillometer hanging out below the plane. When a radiation anomaly was detected, Bob dropped a bag of flour out of the airplane, landed, and returned to the impact zone and staked his mining claims. So ore bodies were discovered. The first Wyoming mill was constructed, and Bob founded a company called Western Nuclear. It was publicly traded, a penny stock. Ultimately, stock value reached $40 per share. Now you may ask, well, what's the relevance to Energy Fuels? Well, Bob was a voracious acquirer of uranium properties while he was at Western Nuclear. And Western Nuclear acquired Hack Canyon and Pigeon claims on the Arizona Strip, as well as other familiar deposits in Malawi and in Australia that, Mark, you'd be familiar with. So uranium, we all know, was at first a strategic resource. It was controlled by governments, and it was used almost exclusively for military purposes, only later becoming essential for commercial nuclear power plants. In the transition from government control and ownership to a civilian private market, Western Nuclear's share price collapsed. Capital for Bob's ambitions evaporated, and he sold his company to Phelps Dodge. And he became a member of the Phelps Dodge board of directors. Now, Bob's aspiration for Western Nuclear, they became way too much for Phelps Dodge. And after a number of board meetings where Bob was on the board, and after a number of meetings where Bob surprised the other board members with the millions of dollars he'd spent on unsanctioned acquisitions, he finally just gave up, left Phelps Dodge, left the board, and left Western Nuclear. Just a little bit of backup. Just a year or two before he left Phelps Dodge, Bob acquired a small coal company near Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And he named that company Energy Fuels Corporation. So you're beginning to get the thread here. It was shortly after this that I joined Bob. This was 1977 as his general counsel. Uranium was still in his blood, so we created a sister corporation called Energy Fuels Nuclear. And that company was focused on the uranium potential of the Colorado Plateau. And Bob's vision for the new company that predated the movie Field of Dreams, if you remember that, by many, many decades. But as in the movie, Bob believed that if you built the uranium mill, i.e. the White Mesa Mill, the ore would show up, the ore would come. So during the first few years, we selected the mill site. We established an ore buying program that encouraged many of the then dormant uranium and vanadium mines in Utah and Colorado to reactivate. But Bob's ambitions, as always, outstripped his financial resources, so we sought some commercial partners for funding, partners that would support Bob's vision. During the latter half of the 1970s, the world was still in shock from the 73 OPEC oil embargo, fearing further instability in the Middle East. Governments and utilities became enamored with the prospects for civilian nuclear energy. At one time, the U.S. was going to have 300 plants, comparable numbers planned for Europe. And in particular, Swiss, French, and German utilities had robust programs, reactors in operation, reactors under construction. And uranium was still viewed in short supply. It was viewed as a scarce resource. And one notable company called Westinghouse Electric had sold a number of reactors and promised to deliver the first core, i.e. the uranium, without behind it having any source of uranium to fulfill that promise. So when Westinghouse defaulted on its promise, uranium prices soared from around $6 a pound to $42, putting Westinghouse obviously under great strain. And at the time, utilities with existing or planned nuclear plants panicked, and many sought partnerships with uranium companies to secure future supplies. They had a little different attitude about getting close to the supply and paying for it. So many sought partnerships, and concurrently, many of the major oil companies began to enter the business and play the uranium game. And solely based upon Bob's vision, the two Swiss utilities invested about 40 million for 40% interest, not in Energy Fuels, but via joint venture in the assets on the uranium assets, basically. Well, 40 million back then, equivalent to about 150 million today. The funds advanced by the Swiss supported the ore buying program, the licensing of the mill site, and the purchase of a number of uranium properties, including of great importance, the mining claims held by Western Nuclear on the Arizona Strip, i.e. Hack Canyon, Pigeon, etc. But notably, the Swiss utilities, they prohibited any expenditures of their investment on building the mill. They insisted that Bob validate his vision and their investment, the Swiss investment, by attracting other investors. The concern about the availability of uranium escalated, and a German utility prepaid Energy Fuels $24 million for future uranium deliveries, taking as security an interest in the White Mesa mill that was built with their prepayment. Ore stockpiles increased steadily. We continued our pursuit of the mill license and permits from the state of Utah and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. At the time, a uranium mill hadn't been built in this country for about 20 years. And of course, there was a plethora of new laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. The NRC was coping with all of these new laws, as were we. And miraculously, the license was received in 1980, less than 2 years after being submitted. And by 1981, the White Mesa mill was commissioned, producing then over the next many months about 1 million pounds of uranium. As Mark indicated, a vanadium recovery circuit also was included, but only operated in times when vanadium prices were high. By the time you had it, they had usually dropped down to $4 a pound. Back then, uranium production from the mill was short-lived. There was a steep decline in demand growth for electricity, and the hysteria associated with the 3 Mile Island accident caused utilities to pause or cancel nuclear plant construction. So instead of 300 plants in the U.S., we ended up with just a little over 100, and many took years and years to build. Absent the anticipated demand for uranium, the price of uranium steadily declined, making it uneconomic to continue mine and mill production. So the Colorado Plateau assets and the mill were mothballed. And at the time, the only mine development that Energy Fuels pursued was focused on the high-grade deposits on the Arizona Strip. Times were bad enough, the U.S. Department of Interior delivered another challenge to us. They designated almost the entirety of the Arizona Strip a wilderness study area, making exploration and new mine development very difficult or almost impossible. But fortunately, Energy Fuels had initiated the development of Hack Canyon and Pigeon Mines. These properties were grandfathered, allowing them to proceed. The future of the Kanab North Mine, however, was very uncertain. Energy Fuels encountered its most severe setback in September 1982, when Bob Adams, newly married to his third wife, fifth marriage, figure that one out, died unexpectedly in New York City on the eve of a joint venture meeting with our Swiss utility partners. With Bob's demise, his financial backing evaporated. Many of his long-term executives departed to pursue their own opportunities. And just prior to their departure, we discovered that Orrin Benton, a financial advisor to Bob, and later the owner of the uranium trading company called Nuexco, Orrin had surreptitiously borrowed and sold the 40% Swiss share of White Mesa production. He sold it to allow the purchase of a 40% interest in the Denver Broncos. So when the deception was discovered by me and a few others, we alerted the Swiss and confirmed that they had absolutely no knowledge that Benton had borrowed their uranium. Bob's now deceased, and into the vacuum and the uncertainty created stepped John Adams, the eldest son of Bob. John provided ownership continuity, and he asked me at the time then to become president of the company. Other contemporaries, Jim Lewis, Brad Doors, Peter Missoula, George Glazier, all assumed executive positions. Matt Matheson, Merle Vincelette, and Roger Smith remained respectively senior VPs, exploration, operations, and mining. The new team immediately confronted an operating budget of $10 million, debts to the Swiss and German utilities of about $60 million, and no revenue, no cash flow. So together we developed a plan called the Roadmap to enable the company to survive. We engaged in further prepayments, strategic partnerships with utilities and other uranium companies that allowed us to continue the development of Hack Canyon and Pigeon. And in spite of Benton's deception, our loyal Swiss partners remained supportive. And even though the price of uranium remained under pressure, the quality of the Arizona Strip ores allowed the mill to restart, and sales were made to utilities in North America, Europe, and Japan. The wilderness withdrawal of the Arizona Strip was the next challenge to solve. We approached the Grand Canyon Trust, the Sierra Club, the National Resources Defense Council, and other national environmental organizations, and after lengthy negotiations, we reached a deal to return 90% of the Arizona Strip to multiple use, including mining. After reaching this agreement, we then had the Herculean task of convincing the U.S. Congress and the U.S. executive branch to embody the agreement in legislation. We had the support of Senators Garn, Hatch, Goldwater, DeConcini, the Arizona and the Utah congressional delegation, and the Arizona Wilderness Act embodying the deal was signed into law in 1984. and it was heralded in the national media, and if you go look, in the New Yorker magazine. The goodwill surrounding our negotiations saw the Sierra Club publicly supporting the development of the Kanab North Mine, something I venture to say you'll never see again. And sadly, this history, the agreement, the landmark legislation were completely ignored and abrogated with a recent withdrawal of the Arizona Strip from mining. So apparently for some, goodwill and trust are not meant to endure. So one further anecdote before I conclude. The reopening of the Arizona Strip with its demonstrated uranium potential led to the largest claim staking war in the history of the United States. It was Energy Fuels versus the French-owned company Pathfinder Mines. They had their staking crews. We had helicopters.
Lots of them.
And lots of them. And every time Pathfinder staked a claim, we'd swoop down, stake claims all around them, making it absolutely impossible for them to have a control point and to have any grouping of claims. Energy Fuels controlled the strip. And our exploration team then made additional discoveries, such as Canyon, which has got appropriately a new name, Pine Nut, Hermit, others as well. The production from Hack Canyon and Pigeon and Kanab North allowed the company to survive and become the largest producer of uranium in the United States, a leader of the U.S. industry, a supplier to utilities around the world, and an internationally respected uranium company. It was quite remarkable at the time because the price was still depressed. Competitors, the oil companies, abandoned their uranium investments, licked their wounds, and exited the industry. Energy Fuels survived. So about a decade ago, many of the early employees gathered for a reunion. It was held in Denver. We reminisced about the trials and tribulations and successes of then the privately held company called Energy Fuels Nuclear. We were there in those days, the early days, we were inexperienced and naive. But we believed we could overcome the obstacles and prosper. It was a wonderful learning experience, saturated with so many memories. And those gathered at the reunion simply referred to the period as Camelot. So, Mark, thank you very much for the opportunity. Not too many people are sleeping out there. Thank you ever so much for listening. I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Any questions, Lee? Nothing. Questions?
Memories short these days? Good.
I kept